All right, we're good to go. Welcome back. How you doing, Melissa? How you doing, Ian? Good to see you both.
Great to see you, Al.
Hey,
Good to see you, Al.
I am. I'm always excited to talk with you too, and particularly around today's topic. And just for a bit of context, when I was in the 90s, I was running a 5-gallon water delivery business in Russia. How about that starting off for a discussion? And anyway, the Sears service profit chain was featured in HBR in February of 97. That's how big of a geek I am. And Tony Rucci, Steve Kern, and there was one other author, and I apologize to him or her. But it showed statistically the link between employee satisfaction at the time, not engagement, and customer satisfaction, and in turn downstream financial outcomes. And fast forward, 25 years or so, we have the systems, processes, technology by which to understand those relationships much, much better. And I'm still taken aback by how little this insight is leveraged. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, is how can we understand how worker or employee behavior affects the customer experience and in turn downstream outcomes, and actually going upstream from that, and how can we as an organization, how can we as leaders affect positively the employee experience? So with that staging, Melissa, you want to introduce yourself a bit and your perspective on this theme?
Great. Yes. Thank you, Al. I love that staging. And we actually have a few other studies to talk about that have found that too, but they all, like that, are 20, 30 years ago. So I'm so happy to be here. My name's Melissa Arronte. I work for Medallia. Sometimes Al calls me Medallia instead of Melissa. So that's okay.
I do.
As long as you think of Medallia, I don't mind.
Yeah.
I joined about a year and a half ago, and I was previously a customer. So I had implemented customer and employee programs with Medallia. And that was the reason I chose Medallia, was to bring customer and employee together. And that's what I was doing in my role. So really excited to be able to talk about this topic, and especially with Ian.
Well, Ian, please.
I'll just follow on from Melissa there. So Ian Cook with Visier. The fascination for me has been helping people thrive so the business thrives, and understanding that journey through organizational development, engagement surveys, the whole, like, how do we understand people? It's a very common quest in terms of how do we understand people so that we know what's good for them, and then that in turn will be good for the business. I come at it from the analytics perspective. What data do we have about the event, the situation, the capabilities around employees that shapes what happens for them and potentially shapes the effect on business. So excited to be sharing the stage with Melissa and kind of putting those two perspectives together, because we think this is kind of the secret sauce to actually cracking the nut we've all been chasing for 30 plus years now.
Yeah, well, thank you for that intro, both of you. And just so all participants can understand what we're going to do here, we're not going to be sharing slides. We're actually going to be discussing this topic. And so I just invited you to add your comments or questions here. If you are really feeling bold, we can actually bring you on stage and you can ask your question directly.
Cool.
To date, no one has taken us up on that, so you consider that a challenge if you if you so like. But yeah, again, this topic is something that from a business leader perspective, and again going back in time, is, oh God, prove to me that our HR program works. Show me the ROI. And I found that question sometimes absurd, because if we're doing an HR program, there are 18 variables that are run through to affect that downstream outcome of sales, for example. And if we influence through that HR program 2%, 4% of that outcome, then arguably we've done a good job. So Melissa, I want to start with you, because Medallia is squarely in the linkage space, if you will, between customer experience, employee experience, and customer experience. So when you hear kind of proving the ROI, what's your response?
Yeah, that's so great, Al. And I want to hear Ian's story too, because I know he's going to have a good one. But here's mine. When I've had the prove the ROI story, it came from the head of HR, not the head of the business that I was supporting. So we had just created a new pre-hire assessment. We created it in-house. We were so proud and so excited. And we actually had a 4% improvement in sales by changing the way we were selecting our bankers. And when I shared it with the senior leader responsible for these sales, he was thrilled. He was like, I'm so glad that we found a way that we can improve sales by 4%. This is excellent work. When I shared it with the CHRO, she said, well, you couldn't do more?
Ouch. Well, it's true, because the order of magnitude has different perspectives, because there is this presumption in doing people analytics that if we have situation A and we, through our insights, the data-driven insights that we produce, we do intervention B, then C will result with a virtual, 100% level of certainty. That's not how the world works. If we're explaining and can influence 4% of the downstream dependent variable, sorry for getting geeky, then we're doing really well, and just socializing that and making there a common understanding around that, I think, is really important. So Ian, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'll share a personal story, which is kind of it's a touchstone for me that drove a lot of the subsequent piece, and it really does highlight that the proof is there. The challenge is often persuading the rest of the business around the proof. So way back when, worked with a large financial services organization, doing sales training, and unlike most sales training, which is like negotiation and value position, we simply did interpersonal training. So how do you read somebody's communication style? How do you read their relationship style, their informational style? We used MBTI as a basis to help educate on that. It's not that you were taught your MBTI, is like, how do you read somebody else's preferences and then adapt? Like, we've all met the highly extrovert salesperson who's just talk, and then wonders why the introvert doesn't buy from them. It's like, well, you didn't let me get a word in edgewise. Like, that really breaks the relationship.
Yep.
What was compelling is we ran through this cycle and we followed up, like as good practitioners should. And the people who were doing the training were kind of blown away that they were getting 10, 20, 30% jumps in revenue from these individual employees because the experience they were creating for their clients was better. And so I've always known that this people experience piece leads to better revenue. The challenge has always been, as you highlight, like there's so many factors. It's so easy for like, oh, well, that wasn't because the people were better. That's because we discounted, or that's because this event happened, or that's because they went to a better patch. Like, it's very, very easy for the value of the people practice to be discounted. So you have to kind of work, 2 or 3 times as hard to actually substantiate it. The other challenge that I see is often when people are convinced, like we were getting in the rate of 20, 30, 50% returns in some of these pieces of work. And that's a little bit of a threat for the CFO, for the CIO. They can maybe show a 5% return. Like, I'm going to save this cost and this massive IT spend. It's going to make us 5% extra. Everybody's really happy. HR kind of walks in and is like, 5%? Like, we got 20, 30%. Because, no, that can't possibly be true, because then I become less significant. So there's a complex personal dynamic around that component. But for me, that proof is there. Every single one of us, I think, sharing stage today has the stories of that proof. And it's really, how do we continue to educate, share, demonstrate, like turn into practice, the things that make this work and make it work at scale. Because it's one thing to do a one-off project. It's another thing to have this as an operating model for the business, which I think is we get to a lot with the Medallia capabilities and building that full picture together. So for me, it's an exciting space. It's a space that's continued to emerge. It's a mission we're all on, and it's a mission where it's about helping people thrive, because then you get their best performance, and that's rewarding for them. So I like it how it all goes a win-win-win, basically.
Yeah, I love that for a lot of reasons. And I'm going to segue over to you, Melissa, in a second. I just want to highlight something that you said, Ian. And when we talk about scaling this, across an enterprise or across a business unit, it needs to be a technology enabled. You want me to mumble that again? Technology enabled. So there's three S's that I talk about: scale, speed, and sustainability. So it needs to be ongoing. It needs to happen fast. When I first started in this field, it took 21 days after a quarter to get the data refreshed. Obviously, we're accelerated much faster over the last 20 years. It's almost instantaneous. It's a beautiful thing. But to have this historical perspective, I think is important. And this is where I'm going to kick it over to you, Melissa, is that there's some leaders who just get this. It's like, you don't have to convince me that there's a connection between the employee experience and customer experience. Of course there is. And even the order of magnitude isn't as important, is the fact that I need to improve that dynamic. Net promoter score is obviously critically important to many organizations on the customer side. And we're talking about employee NPS now. So, Melissa, what are your comments and ideas around the idea that there are certain leaders that get it, and really we hopefully toggle to this place where we're not selling the concept as much, but we're actually looking to improve that dynamic? What are your thoughts there?
I mean, again, I think I would comment like years ago. I mean, probably 25 years ago, I was approaching a head of claims at a major insurance company and offering to do a study for him that I thought would improve his business. And he said, well, of course, improving employee experience will improve my business. You can probably even do it to a greater extent than I can get from improving systems and processes. They're so expensive and give such a small return. I just need to understand how. So it wasn't the need to convince. Yet, when I see a lot of clients today, or potential clients in HR, they're not that interested in the outcome of customer experience. Of course, that's not true of everyone. There are some that are so passionate and they've totally figured it out. But that's one of the things that Ian and I are really passionate about, is driving business outcomes. And the one in particular today to talk about is customer experience, which is such a powerful combination of our two organizations, because clearly the employee experience drives the customer experience. And we have some deeper thoughts on kind of how that happens and, more details.
Ian, what are your thoughts on leaders like getting it? Like, I get, and again, I got to be careful because it's like at this stage of my life, want to work with people who get it. And if I'm spending a lot of time trying to sell a concept, that is, to someone who's just not willing to be nudged in that direction, it invites the question, is that a proper use of time? So I guess the pointed question is, are you seeing more leaders kind of getting it where they don't have to be sold on this dynamic that's really now about improving it?
Totally. I was talking with a colleague yesterday about this notion of a generational change, and I would liken it to the way that DEI has moved in terms of the connection to senior executives over the last year has massively accelerated, but it's kind of moved steadily over the last 20 years, where you go into a business, you might find one or two champions. Then there's another wave, and that's like 3 or 4 champions. And then there's another wave, and it's like 5 or 10 champions. Now, the majority of people would champion it. I think you would be kind of hard pressed to find somebody who didn't understand the issue, understand the effect of the issue, understand the importance of the issue. So I feel we're not quite at the same place in terms of D&I, but we're heading that same direction where the understanding of business, the reality of business, the way in which business works. Again, when you make things, like when you make objects and your spend on people is 20% of your total operating expense, you have a very different perspective on business. When you make things like software and services and 90% of your spend is on people, and the only variable you have to control to make your business successful or poor is people. And far more businesses run that way. Far more people have grown up in those businesses. There's far more awareness of, like, actually, cloud computing, that just costs money.
Yeah.
Distribution in a channel, there's thousands of them. It just costs money. Like, it's actually easy. You can crowdsource marketing these days. What differentiates? Well, it's the people that you crowdsource and their creativity, their capacity to break through the noise, their commitment to driving it through. So I think there's just a much vaster awareness of the only variable that is sort of still left uncontrolled that is important to control is performance of people. So, that's a long, long way of saying people are starting to get it. And I think we're kind of at the tipping point where we're in that majority view, and people want guidance and leadership and clarity. It's like, I know this is true, but just help me understand how. Exactly as Medallia Melissa says. Well, that's going to be the joke of today, isn't it?
That wasn't me. That was me.
I know. I don't even know where that came from. Exactly as Melissa says. You don't have to convince me. You actually just have to help guide me. And I think that's again where the excitement for Visier with Medallia is, in terms of, we've got that capacity, we've got the understanding, we've got the data at the kind of pace. Like, we don't have to make it a handcrafted project. We can stick it together and tell people why, in near real time, real enough time to make a difference. I'll say that.
Yeah, I want to invite the audience to ask questions or provide comments, and I'm going to synthesize a few comments that came through in this question to you, Melissa. I almost made the same thing. Is that employee experience is a buzzword in one form, it's a critical initiative in another form, and in fact, it's an ongoing way of doing business in yet another form. However, there are those who have not committed to it yet. So my question to you, Melissa, if I am a CHRO, head of talent, or someone within HR who is going to influence leaders to adopt this approach, this, looking at human-centered design and applying design thinking principles and creating personas to create an employee experience initiative, what are the key, maybe 2 or 3 selling points that you would put forth to say, hey, okay, this is really critical?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. I can only choose 2 or 3.
Go half dozen if you want.
I'll keep it short. One that I think can be incredibly influential right now is the inextricable tie between employee experience and DE&I. So if we think about employee experience, kind of the way you were just hearing Ian talk about, is it's really allowing people to have an impact, right? So employees come to work every day to serve the customer. And that might be because they're creating an accounting process, or maybe they're creating new software, or maybe they're delivering a service directly to a customer, but they're coming to have an impact. They came here to make a difference. They want to be a part of something bigger than themselves. And what happens is we as employers unintentionally put obstacles in their way. And for diverse employees, there are even more obstacles that are completely irrelevant to work, right? That are related to something about the person that's just a bias. And so when you think about employee experience, if you really think about it, allowing all employees to have an impact, all employees to make a difference, bring all their skills and values to serve the customer is exactly what we want. And so working on employee experience is working on DE&I and bringing it to kind of the extreme. So I think there's no better case than that.
I love that you started there, because number one, I couldn't agree more. I mean, Ian, what are your selling points for employee experience?
Yeah, a good question. I think it's how on earth do you run your business? Like, how do you understand the conversations, the ebb and flow of energy, the elements that are affecting the outcomes that you care about, if you're not closely listening to employees? And fortunately, we're well beyond this notion. It's like, well, we ask you once a year and you should be grateful, and that's that. It's like we got to a point of understanding that people's responses to work, the circumstances around them, ebb and flow. Like, not everybody has a good day every day. Not everybody has a bad day every day. And so, understanding the experience of work as it's continues through the months, weeks, and the different phases. Like it's just a super important component for all the decisions you make about should we do X or Y, should we go hybrid, should we go remote, should we ask people to come back to the office, should we, like, I don't even know how you would make those decisions without seeking data. And I know people are, and I know a lot of those people are kind of challenged and a little bit stuck because they don't have the data.
Yeah.
But it's just one of those really simple examples of you could really, really, really dent the momentum of your workforce by making the wrong kind of decisions right now about return to work. And without data, then you're kind of just doing your best guess. And like, this is the 21st century. Guessing's kind of outmoded.
Yeah. Melissa, did you want to comment on it?
Yeah, I just can't overemphasize the point that Ian has made. Managers, people are making these decisions about the employee experience every day. So to say that you're not in it, you're doing it. You're just doing it without data. You're doing it with anecdotal information instead of well-informed evidence-based decisions.
I mean, to your point, there is an employee experience that's being had. Just exactly. Do you understand what that experience is, and do you then know how to improve it? And to your point, Melissa, do you know the dimensionality of it, the personas? Ian?
Because this is the other point, I think, just to double down on what you're saying, Al, like there's many experiences. Like I used to frustration point with the engagement survey, people go, oh, we got 95% participation. Isn't that great? And it's like, well, no, it's probably irrelevant. Like if you asked across your whole population and you were properly sampled, I'm going to bet by the time you had 30% contribution, you knew what the issues were, because the shape of your bell is the shape of your bell. It's when you get into experience for different populations in different phases at different times, journey of the new employee, the long-standing employee, it's actually the segmentation and the understanding of the use of that segmentation that is so vital. It's there isn't an experience of work. My experience is way different from. I love talking to people who join Visier, because it's like I cannot see what they can see. So it's that whole piece of like, so what kind of business are we? Because I'm so in it that I'm blind to things, and so that is a really, really important factor, because if you're trying to grow and extend, if you have a core that feels exclusive, you aren't going to bring people in. You aren't going to make them part of the gang that build momentum. And that's really, really valuable information. So it's experiences, and therefore, being able to capture, understand across a wide range of places. Again, it's what I love about Medallia's technology. It's got that ability to put listening posts in lots of places, so that you're not just like, well, what's your experience today? It's more sophisticated and nuanced than that, which I think is really important in making the right decisions.
It was Peter Drucker who's credited with saying, culture eats strategy for lunch or breakfast. I don't remember, but one of the two.
I think it's breakfast, to be really honest. It's right there.
It's right there. So I start with that because many are trying to consciously create their culture, which is fantastic. The ability to do that without data as we're returning to workplace, as DEI becomes an increasingly important, not only initiative, but ongoing program. So there's a critical nature to the point that you both made in listening and learning from your workforce. And something that I've shared with both of you, and in my view, that after the basics, we as human beings want to be seen, we want to be heard, and we want to be empowered. We don't want to be ignored, we don't want to be invisible, and we don't necessarily want to be told what to do. We want to, again, be heard and have some ways to move forward and use our own skills and abilities to get where we want to go. So with that staging, Melissa, Medallia has worked to understand the customer value proposition, what their experience is, and there's certain elements of the culture of employee behavior. After all, that's the title of this session, behavior, and understanding how that dynamic works. So my question to you is that, by definition, is a multifunction approach. You have marketing, you have customer experience, but you also have operations, you have HR, you have diversity, equity, inclusion. You have IT. So there's a host of stakeholders. And so what is, for lack of a better term, the governance model? What do you advocate to understand how these dots connect and in turn manage it systematically as opposed to this siloed approach?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Al, but I do think it's a question that causes companies to freeze. They hear all the different stakeholders, bringing all these different groups together. It just seems like so much. Like, how do we ever get started? And so I often say to them, well, let's just start someplace simple, right? Let's just start first with listening to employees. And of course, we'd recommend Medallia, and segmenting them into meaningful segments so we can understand how the experiences vary. And a great way to do that would be with Visier. So the combination of the two of us together really give you both the behavior and the emotion or the perspective. I'll give you a concrete example, and then I'd love for Ian to add on. So something as simple as an employee applying for a job internally and being rejected. So this is a significant moment, right? And this is a time when you were saying, Al, you really feel not heard, not listened to, not valued, a lot of the nots. You certainly aren't feeling like you're making an impact or having a difference. So, but to figure that out, you actually need to bring together a couple different databases. You need your core HRIS and you need your ATS, right? And you need the decision to have been actually entered by a recruiter to flow through. So Visier can bring that data, where Medallia can bring a survey or a listening post at that point. And it could be something very simple, just asking how things are for them so we can understand, because that may still be a very valued employee, but there were so many great applicants or there's so many other reasons why they weren't selected. But such an opportunity to start at something very specific and simple and improve it, because we know this is a risk of turnover for an employee having had this, and we could find this from Visier. Oh, Ian.
I love your example, Melissa. I was going to add a few points and then share another example that we've talked about a lot with our kind of mutual customers. I think that's a really important point, and because often the individual applying internally isn't going to get on the radar of the manager. I think a lot of the times we've relied on managers to mediate the experience, and a lot of HR time is spent praising the good ones and managing the average ones and trying to undo the damage of the bad ones. There's a spectrum there. Whereas an internal job application may not get on the radar of the manager. So having the data flow that says, Jane put in a job application, Jane did get interviewed but didn't get selected. Okay, let's go and ask so that we've got that input. That's a brilliant use of data. There's all that flow of information and events that you can then trigger listening and again, not necessarily a survey, like a bunch of more sophisticated ways of pulling that data. And again, to Melissa's point about people freezing, we've had a number of conversations like, so how do I get started with this? One real simple example that we have around the event set and the listening set, if we separate those two out, is the classic is the onboarding situation. It's become the gold standard in HR that you sample at 30, 60, 90 days. And it's logical, it makes sense. Kind of in lieu of other information, there is no better standard. When you actually have data, you can actually see where the trigger events are for people exiting in that ramp phase. A really, really simple job, like often people will be exiting within 5, 10, 12 days. Like you do your first sample at 30 because that's the accepted norm, and lo and behold, you never catch the people who like literally bounce out because like, oh my God, what did I start doing? Alternatively, you may have a really long ramp time. Like for us, the technology we work on, we use some quite sophisticated, to do what we do, we have to use some pretty sophisticated language. So, 90 days can be the ramp time for somebody to start being comfortable doing work. Like it literally take them that long to learn the code base, to get into the different pieces. So they don't really know what they're producing until they've gone through a full release cycle. So let's just say 6 months is actually the point where they're fully ramped. And so us asking at 90 days, like, no, I'm still loving it. Like I've just spent all this time learning Scala. This is fantastic. Let me at it. Whereas it's like, oh man, I didn't know coding was going to be, or like the dev cycle was going to be so tough. Listening at that point. And so you see that in the event stream. When did people leave? What was the duration? What's high frequency, low frequency? What's the shortest, longest? And you actually use that data to understand where should we listen. And so the event set of real employee behavior drives the understanding of where and how to listen, that then actually gives you that really detailed picture on like, yeah, we know what's going on and we can make this change. And so it chunks it down into manageable chunks, because everybody's talking about experience, and depending on who you listen to, you've basically got to rebuild everything from the ground up instantly, which as Melissa says, most people would freeze, and with good reason. It's like, that seems like you're swallowing an elephant, whereas actually breaking it down into like, where are the events, which kinds of events are really important, which ones can you orchestrate to then change and show that cycle and then grow, is actually a far more realistic approach to deploying an approach that gets you results fast, and helps this kind of grow forward. So we again, two great examples of like practically what does this experience and linkage thing mean.
Well, yeah, thank you for that example, both of you. And just if you're a listener, I just created a poll, and you can go, and the question is, does your organization work to link employee experience with the customer experience? There's 3 options. Yes, we do ongoing. No, we haven't done this. And the third one, kind of, we do it ad hoc. So, if you want to jump over and take that poll, that would be great. And I'll close it in a few minutes here. My question to you, because if I'm a listener here and I'm like, well, we're kind of doing employee experience, we do customer experience, we don't really have the systematic way to manage it ongoing, going back to this notion of, governance, because I agree with you, Melissa, many organizations are stuck. They view it as, too complex. They don't have an existing process, to manage it. For those who are in that situation, Melissa, what would you say to them? I mean, and let me just say one more thing about it, if you would allow me. Many leaders haven't grown up with this level of data, with this tools. They don't understand this. Like, I've been doing this for 30 years. Why do I need this now? And so, and even go back further before the pandemic, it was McKinsey, Josh Burst, and Willard Styles Watson, all these organizations saying we need new management models. We have this 50, 70-year-old way of thinking in a hierarchy and functions, and we're not agile enough. And so I believe COVID created the impetus for new ways of managing a business. However, some are falling back to the inertia of these past 70 years into the old way of doing things, while others have taken a more innovative approach. Hey, this has been disruption. We're going to celebrate disruption, not only in terms of our digital transformation, but how we make decisions and how we improve the employee experience, customer experience, and all that. So with that, probably elongated staging, Melissa, going back to the initial question, I mean, how do you get people, leaders that is, unstuck and create a new way to absorb this information and in turn take appropriate action?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Al. So one of the things I see is they get themselves stuck in a new way. So when they think it's too complex, they take it to simple, and they just look at the relationship between EX and CX, really high level, like employee engagement, customer satisfaction, or NPS. And they say, well, there really isn't a relationship, or the relationship's very weak. But they're missing some key pieces of information here. And often it can be employee behaviors that could come from a system like Visier, or it may be other perspectives from the employees that could come from deeper survey feedback using text analytics to understand what are employees saying about what's happening. So for example, you're looking at a retail store and you're saying, well, the stores with the highest customer experience don't always necessarily have the highest employee engagement. But then you look and you find, well, turnover has been happening, or we've just transferred a number of employees to new departments, or, there are other behaviors that have been happening. Some have had training, some haven't had training. So there's so many other useful pieces of information that we can bring in. And we actually have a model borrowed from work done by Fred Reicheld, who is the founder of NPS on the customer experience side, and then William Macy, an excellent researcher, former founder of Altera, and he was studying at the time service climate and customer satisfaction. So these all happened at the same time that you're talking about the Sears profit chain. And what they're able to find is that it's a combination of employee perceptions and behaviors. We can look at things like, are senior leaders or managers setting the example for employees on how to interact with customers? Do we have reward systems that are related to customer experience? Do we give employees feedback from customers so that they're able to understand customers' response and be able to continually improve for it? Do we integrate it into their work? Do we empower employees to take action on behalf of customers, innovate for customers? And there's a few other variables, but it's really bringing together the employee behaviors and their perceptions together to understand how the experience impacts the customer.
I love that you're talking about perceptions, because I think it's a blind spot for many. Obviously it's cliche, and there's a large about this cliche that's true. Perception is reality. And so, how it's long been said that a true culture is the stories that the employees tell about their experience at work. Those stories are the culture. You can want the culture to be anything, but it's what the workers tell themselves is really, the culture. And that's based on perception, which is based on how leaders communicate, how managers, help them, navigate remote work and, all their, personal constraints, whether it be taking care of kids or, elder care or so forth. Ian, you come from this place where you're obviously representing a technology. There's all this data that needs to be aggregated, not only across the employee life cycle for this to happen, but from other different sources to not only understand the employee experience, but how it's affecting these downstream outcomes, or in some cases, upstream, variables. So can you speak to, and a question came in around the need for not only data literacy, but to understand that a solution like Visier, and I'm not going to apologize for it seemingly self-serving, because I believe it to be true. This doesn't happen by accident. Bringing together data, staging the data, is necessary for all this work to happen. Can you speak to that?
No, for sure. And I think it's a great part of the theme we've been chasing, is like, why haven't people been doing this? And I think a lot of the reason why people haven't been doing this was because it was hard, it was slow, the technologies weren't mature enough that you could do it, but you would do it with, somebody like Melissa with a PhD, grabbing a bunch of data, putting it in a database, writing SQL queries, test and retest. Mm-hmm. What's now happening, and again, Melissa's story kind of really resonates why Visier and Medallia together is an exciting piece. It's a three-legged stool. So we've got the CX data. We've studied that a lot. Like there was a straight line to revenue, so people invested there. We're building our understanding of EX, and again, there's been that, depending who you believe, there's that known cycle between EX and CX, and maybe it's there, maybe it's not. There's that piece. The third piece is the event stream. Like, did the person's manager change? Did half of the people in the team they're working on leave? Did they get passed over for promotion? Did they get passed over for a pay rise? And that's that third piece. Like, lots of people who are not in people analytics thinks it's simple because you're just dealing with people. It's actually the more complicated space. I think marketing analytics and people analytics share the volatility and highly referenced nature of data. Unlike finance or engineering, which it obeys the laws of physics, when you're dealing with people analytics, you're dealing in an ecosystem with multiple sets of variables. And so the technology has to be there, and it has to be there fast enough so the data is clear and present as the decisions are being made. And that's really the space that we've got to over the last 10 years is you don't have to build a data warehouse. You don't have to write a SQL statement. You don't have to have a specialist artisan who knows how to mesh this together to make an answer. All of that stuff actually comes pre-made, where it's add data, cleanse organized data, and then service it. And the other effect for that is like how we get to this sort of, how it was done versus to how it's being done now is then the distribution. It's because it's in the old way, you would do that study, you would present it to the executive, you would get the deck, they would nod and go, yeah, this is fantastic. And then you would try and put those things into practice because you knew it was right, you just couldn't execute daily. The technology we have now, like Medallia is listening and processing that listening daily. Visier is ingesting events daily. We can both go out to hundreds, if not thousands of managers at will. Mm-hmm. So it's not just you're able to understand the problem, you're actually able to distribute the data to make decisions at will. And there's a third piece, because I kind of sit on the fence and the people need to be more analytical. And I actually think analytics needs to be more people-oriented, where the technologies and people like Melissa and myself layer in our expertise to the data so the consumer has an answer. Again, like lots of people come and say, oh, do you do dashboards? It's like, sure, we can do dashboards. What's a dashboard going to do for your decision maker?
Right.
We would rather do less and change one decision than simply put up a dashboard for people to look at. So success in analytics is not a pretty looking chart. It's somebody using the chart to go, oh my God, I need to do something different. And only with that lens, again, it's a lens that Medallia brings because of the processing they do in the background. It's a lens that Visier shares because of the processing we do in the background. And that's a piece that I think folks are often missing in the analytics debate. It's like, oh, look at this fantastic chart I make. It's really cool. It's great. Did anybody use it? No. Then it's a nice piece of work. It's not material to your business.
Yeah, Ian, you and I haven't seen each other in a while, but I could hug you for saying that. I agree. I just did a training recently, and there's a lot of energy around. We need to be better data-driven storytellers, and it dawned on me before, but it was emphasized in that experience, is that number one, we have to know the stories that we want to tell beforehand in many cases. Yeah. And we need to get to those stories as quickly and as accurately as possible. And so that means having some specialists help create a system and process that provides that insight. And what has happened in many organizations, well, I've spent a lot of money on this core HR system in the order of millions of dollars. My insight's going to come next year. And as we all know, HR data is unique. There's privacy concerns, so that all takes work. And so having specialists address that work, in my view, is critical. And I don't think I'm going to get any argument on that. So, Melissa, can you just share your perspectives on this? Because in the example Ian just showed or just offered up, you as a researcher would do this on an event-driven basis, meaning you'd stage the data, you'd create the deliverable, you'd communicate the deliverable, and you'd go in and say, in your internal customer group, say, that's fantastic. What about that? Hey, can you go do that again? And, the scalability wouldn't be there because, again, it would be done on an event-driven basis. So, what are your thoughts to get, this, the requisite work done, the requisite systems purchased, so this insight can be generated on an ongoing, on-demand basis?
Yeah, you're exactly right. That is what we used to do, special projects and come and deliver, and here's the answer. And
Mhm.
but I think what you describe, Al, really is the scientific method, right?
Yeah.
We have to come with a question.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
can't just look at data or buy an expensive system and expect to find an insight. You might find something, maybe it's relevant, but managers are full of great hypotheses. Just ask them what their questions are. We had a really fun one when I first joined a bank years ago, and they were saying we should hire people to be bankers. They should come from a restaurant. And everyone was trying to find people who worked at a restaurant to become a retail banker. I said, it can't possibly be. Our best source of candidates for a banker is someone who worked in a restaurant. It must be someone who was previously a banker has got to be our best source. So let's just test it out, because we had bank managers going to restaurants saying, excellent customer service. Here's my business card. Please apply to work in my branch. Right? Because they were trying to get good customer service. So they'd experienced good customer service. So what we did, we analyzed the data and looked at people who had been previous bankers and became bankers, and people who had previously worked in a restaurant and became bankers. Not surprisingly, previous bankers made better bankers than previous restaurant employees, but there was a difference. If you worked for a fast food restaurant, you were a pretty good banker, because you were used to lots of guidelines and rules to follow, and you delivered customer experience or customer service in a particular way. But when you worked at a more less fast food, more nice dining, you could deliver the customer experience in the way you wanted because you were given that latitude. But that was very difficult in a bank where you had to follow a lot of rules and regulations. So getting that kind of question from a manager and then being able to test it out is exactly what we want to do, and a great way to bring employee and customer together, because usually when you're finding a customer problem that the manager has a hypothesis about, you can find the source in the employee.
Yeah, there's a comment came through from Kelly. It's like, what an interesting story. I couldn't agree more. I'm not going to look at a banker again, the same way again. Where did you work before? No, it's a great story. Ian, your thoughts there?
I think Melissa nails it in terms of thinking about this as a business problem, as a practice, as an approach to helping your business. Don't look to the data for the problem. Look to the managers. You'll have seen some of the. We recently did our Visier's conferences, Outsmart, and a lot of the practitioners that are presenting there are saying the same thing. It's like, I didn't sit in a box with HR and work out what measures should we do. I went to specific units in the business and said, how do you use people data to try and make your business better? And then we built products to serve those people. And so people analytics, again, I think it's part of that. It used to be HR analytics way back when. Then it kind of became workforce analytics, brief sojourn as talent intelligence. And now I think we've all settled on this notion of people analytics, recognizing that it's beyond HR. It's HR's effect or people's effect on the business, and that the practice is really intended to serve that. So, going straight to the manager, I think is the right practice. It's proven again and again in our world to be effective, and it solves that. It kind of naturally puts the right approach to data in place. Visier's differentiation, and I see it in Medallia's product as well, is we actually started with the question. It's why BI tools often fail. It's why IT projects to build analytics often fail, is because they start with the data. But you can't understand the shape of the data unless you know the question you want to answer. So when you have the technical expertise driving the cart looks like what the technician thinks it should look like. When you have the person who's driving the buggy, explaining what the cart needs to do, you get a different picture. We meet the people, we meet the groups who've built with IT. That's why I got into the space. I would be pulled in by a CHRO saying, like, I asked for this information, Ian, I'm not getting it. And then the IT analyst would be like, no, this is what you asked for. And it wasn't, but they couldn't see each other's world. So, both parties were doing their absolute best. It's one of those painful moments where you just know people live in such different worlds that they need that interface. So kind of going back to like starting with the question and then shaping the data down from there. So question, measures, then data, not data, then whatever, then whatever. That is, again, it's a proven path. Medallia works that way, Visier works that way. The success of the results we bring highlight that as the right path. It's the way to get this done. Who has the questions? Well, the people managers, because they have the people.
Right. Yeah. As we start to wrap up now, I mean, by the way, I'm going to think about carts and buggies and bank tellers and fast food. Yeah. But I mean, it's really important. I just to emphasize your point. The questions and those can be repackaged as hypotheses. Then we identify the requisite data to help test those hypotheses and validate it, or find a different dynamic that we have to be curious about and explore further. So, Melissa, as we start to wrap up now, what are some of your final thoughts around, okay, if I want to do this, because in the poll, most of the people are not doing employee experience initiatives yet. And so my hope is that employee experience, whatever we call it moving forward, becomes a salient way of doing business, of formulating talent strategies, of creating culture, and really taking a human-centered approach to how we're communicating with our workers. So what are your thoughts there in terms of, okay, if you want to get going, I know starting with the question and creating the space, but we need technology. And that's because that generates the data, that analyzes the data, that produces, the insight. So, closing thoughts and ideas.
Yeah, for sure. So some real practical advice. I think one of the obstacles we face in people analytics, and we spoke about this recently, Al, is that many of us are introverts. And I know I'd love to sit in an office and analyze data all day. That would make me perfectly happy. But I'm not going to find out the business questions in order to analyze the data and come up with these cool insights if I don't go out and talk to people. And so I remember years ago when my little HR analytics team was just 3 people, and we would get together every quarter and challenge each other that you have to meet 2 people in the business. Go out, meet them, talk to them, and find out what they're doing, what's important to them, what's going on, what are their problems. And a common problem that you'll find in many places, especially in financial services, is things are not simple. They're complex. It's a huge part of employee experience and customer experience. Find out where they're having trouble with things not being simple and start employee listening program. Of course, we'd love if you use Medallia, but you can use anything to start learning, understanding what employees have to say, make it open and easy for them to just tell you. Don't ask them 60 questions. Maybe ask them 2 or 3 and just let them tell you. Solve that business problem and use the data to do so. And that will get you started on employee experience. But unfortunately, we have to talk to people. That really is the way it happens.
Coming from an introvert. Oh, thank you for that. And I believe it's spot on. Ian?
Oh, I love the advice. I think we're gonna, if we may, Melissa, we may capture that and just spread it as a practice. Like if you're running a people analytics team, if you haven't talked to the business in 2 weeks, then it's time to get out there. Building on that, what I would say is understanding the current wave that's coming. Like depending on who you listen to, you're going to lose anywhere between half and all of your employees in the next wave because everybody's ready to rush. Mm-hmm. So I think that's an overstated rate of change, but I do think there is pressure for change, and that's going to impact businesses. And so one of the things around like how do we get the technology investment that means we can do this fast enough that we can do this without just trying to add bodies is to connect to a clear and urgent challenge to the business. And so clear and urgent challenge around enough of the right people, possibly to keep the lights on, but certainly to grow revenues. And so, well, what's the best way? Again, half the world thinks the best way is just to go hire more. Actually, the best way to deal with a retention challenge is to focus on retention. Like it's way easier to keep somebody. It's a lot easier to stop somebody pivoting out than it is to bring somebody brand new in. The risk is way less. It's way higher on the will a net new person work out. So, understanding the macro picture, there is this wave of change coming. Throwing money at the problem is not going to last very well because everybody else will just throw money at the problem and we'll just, create inflation because we'll just add lots of cost to our business. So listening, and as Melissa says, listening to certain populations, key groups. This isn't a do for everybody. This is a do for where it counts kind of project. So listening, tracking, using the data you have about the movement rates, using the information you have about why, starting to focus on, let's make sure we retain the core that keeps our business safe and growing, and making that an urgent priority. So this isn't an HR program that we'd like to hear what employees saying. Like, this is a business imperative, because without it, we might not be growing at the rate that we want.
Yeah.
Changes the conversation, changes the investment. It becomes cheap at that point. It becomes so cheap, it's not funny.
Well, again, love what you both have shared today. Thanks for doing what you do. I could not agree more. In fact, this upcoming challenge that you're talking around about retention and engagement is something I'm going to speak about tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Pacific, because I am increasingly, as I look at the data, believe that to be true. And those organizations that are set up and have done employee experience initiatives, listened, learned, adapted, are going to be at a competitive advantage over those who have not. And so, it's, in my view, a non-negotiable if you're going to be a responsible business leader, whether it be within HR or out. So again, thank you both. Thanks for doing what you do, and hope to see you in person before too long. Sound good?
Sounds great, Al. Yeah, I'll collect on that Haga HR Tech if I can travel.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah.